These are the 4 people who did surgery on themselves. Leonid Rogozov. Arctic expeditions are a dangerous business, and Leonid found himself on a 12-person expedition in April 1961 to the Arctic outpost of Novolazarevskaya, during which he started to feel pain in the lower right side of his abdomen.
I did not sleep at all last night. It hurts like the devil, a snowstorm whipping through my soul, wailing like 100 jackals.
He had no difficulty in diagnosing acute appendicitis, a life-threatening disease if left untreated. It would take at least 36 days for him to get back to Russia.
No obvious symptoms that perforation is imminent, but an oppressive feeling of foreboding hangs over me.
Leonid, being a practical man and seeing that his options had run thin, decided it was the best course of action to fix it himself.
This is it. I have to think through the only possible way out, to operate on myself. It is almost impossible, but I can't just fold my arms and give up.
Now it's important to note that all of this was happening in the context of the Cold War. It would be terrible PR for the USSR if this surgery went awry. With all the famines in the motherland, more bad PR could spell an early end to communist rule. So the commander contacted the high-ranking USSR officers in Moscow to ask for a blessing. The blessing was granted, and Rogozov then made the preparations. He was to win back his life. Leonid wrote up a detailed plan for how the operation would unfold. There was no room for error. He even wrote what needed to be done when he would lose consciousness. Leonid notes that he was scared, but after the injection of the local anesthetic, he was laser focused. A mirror was used in the beginning of the surgery, but it was more confusing than helping.
The bleeding is quite heavy, but I take my time. Opening the peritoneum, I injured the blind gut and had to sew it up. I grow weaker and weaker. My head starts to spin. Every 4 to 5 minutes, I rest for 20 seconds.
And slowly but surely worked his way to the appendix.
Finally it is here, the cursed appendage. With horror, I noticed the dark stain at its base. That means just a day longer and it would have burst. My heart seized up and noticeably slowed. My hands felt like rubber. All that was left was removing my appendix.
After nearly 2 hours, Leonid had set the final stitch. He rested, and dazed and confused he asked his assistants to wash his equipment. He took his antibiotics and sleeping tablets to get through the night. Amazingly, he did not get infected, and after just 2 weeks, he returned to normal duty. Charles-Auguste de Maldigny. Charles was a French aristocrat doctor. With his independent wealth, he helped the less fortunate with free surgeries out of noblesse oblige. During his younger years, he suffered from bladder stones. Bladder stones were crudely cut away by making an incision on top of the bladder and digging through it. The account of his story can be found in Lettres sur la lithotritie. I am 26 years old. While still young, I was afflicted 7 times by bladder stones. In 1816, I was cut for the stone for the first time in Longueville. The calculus which was removed was broken during its extraction. Charles-Auguste was not relieved after his first operation. The operator had even left a bit of sponge in his bladder, which caused him even more agony. He was cut again, this time with the intention of removing anything that should not be there. But after the operation, an infection occurred and the pain got worse. The inflammation of the bladder became very violent and soon spread to the abdomen. The 3rd day after the operation, I had a very abundant hemorrhage from one of the arteries which had been cut. This loss of blood was so considerable that it made me fear for my life. This was all before he was 18 years old, but Charles had the faith and he went to Strasbourg to be relieved of a small stone. He recovered quickly and 3 years later had a similar operation for a bigger stone. In 1823, I was operated on once more. The calculus was medium-sized. I was not confined to bed for too long. Charles-Auguste decided to join the military to practice his surgical skills. During this time, after studying the operation for years through his experience and medical studies, he once again went under the knife, but this time it was him wielding it. After having made the necessary preparations, I placed myself before a looking glass. This puncture made, I rested a few seconds. Then I enlarged the opening of the integuments and carried my finger into the wound. With my index and middle finger, I searched for and soon succeeded in extracting a calculus about the size of a large nut. The operation was successful and no infections were had after. Charles made a perfect recovery. He lived to be 77 years old and continued his life as a doctor and a spiritual medium to musical ghosts. Inés Ramirez Perez. Inés was pregnant of her second child in the year 2000, her first being a stillborn. She wanted badly to bring a healthy child into the world. Inés found herself alone in a one-room cabin high in the mountains of southern Mexico. She felt the pounding pains of childbirth, but the nearest clinic was 50 miles away, over treacherous mountain paths with many a wild animal looking for prey. With her husband away drinking with his pals in a cantina, and with no phone, she decided to grab a bottle of rubbing alcohol and a 6-inch knife used to prey on the same animals of the mountains and pointed it at her belly. She knew to sit forward in a traditional Indian birthing position, ensuring that she would not hit the intestines. Her hand needed to be steady as the child was still at the surface, but she was desperate and she would not let her baby die. She cut through the skin, the fat, and muscles before reaching the uterus. She saw her baby boy alive and cut away the umbilical cord with scissors before she lost consciousness. When her husband returned, she was rushed to the clinic, and in the operation room, Dr. Jesus Guzman opened her up, to see to his big surprise that the uterus had returned to its normal size, with no bleeding or signs of infection. When asked what guided her in the operation, she answered, "I had slaughtered chickens and other animals." Today, her son Orlando is a healthy 23-year-old, and his mother is considered to be the only woman known to have performed a successful cesarean section on herself. Aron Ralston. In 2003, a 27-year-old climber was exploring the Utah Canyon when he fell into a crevice with a boulder violently trapping his arm into the wall. Ralston describes the feeling as getting your finger stuck in a door, but 100 times worse. Being an adventurous loner, he did not tell anyone of his exploration, and with no phone, he started a debate in his head. "You're gonna have to cut your arm off." "I don't want to cut my arm off." "Dude, you're gonna have to cut your arm off." The stone, crushing every bone in his arm, was not to move. Chipping would have taken months. Not eating and drinking for days made Aron fall in and out of consciousness. But after hours of meditation, he realized he needed to cut off his useless arm. In my mind, it was already detached. It's rubbish. It's not going to kill you. Get rid of it, Aron. It's no longer my arm. Taking the knife from his cheap toolkit in his hand, he started to make the first cut. Surprisingly, gases started to burst out. The arm had already started to disintegrate. His skin was like the skin of boiled milk. The knife slipped in with ease, which caused Aron to rage at his arm. After all this emotional discipline, it all burst out of him. He broke his arm using the boulder and using his rage to cut the remaining part away, and he used this rope as a tourniquet to make sure that he wouldn't bleed to death. Eventually, Ralston made it out alive, and a movie is made of this story called 127 Hours. This was the list of people performing surgery on themselves. Do you think you would have done the same in their shoes? Let me know what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching. Take care.